Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the leather boots of a medieval beekeeper. And trust me, you're about to discover why this profession had a mortality rate that would make modern astronauts nervous. Picture this. You're waking up in a cramped, smoky hovel as the first pale light of dawn creeps through gaps in your thatched roof. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else, something that makes your skin crawl with prehistoric fear. It's the low, ominous hum of 10,000 wings preparing for war, and you probably won't survive what's coming next. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how this community spans the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stretch your aching limbs on what passes for a mattress, basically a sack stuffed with straw that's probably hosting its own ecosystem of medieval parasites. The sound grows louder, more insistent, like nature's own alarm clock designed by a sadistic deity. Through your single, horn-scraped window, you can see them. Clouds of bees swarming around the dozen skep hives that represent your livelihood, your death sentence, and your only hope of survival, all rolled into one terrifying package. Medieval beekeeping wasn't just a job. It was a daily dance with death that required the delicate balance of a diplomat, negotiating with tiny, flying terrorists armed with biological weapons. These weren't the docile, selectively bred honeybees of today. These were their wild, aggressive ancestors who viewed every human interaction as a declaration of war. The average medieval bee colony contained between 20,000 to 80,000 individuals, each one capable of delivering a sting that could send you into anaphylactic shock, a medical condition that wouldn't even have a name for another 6 centuries. You stumble to your feet, joints protesting after a night on medieval bedding that would make a prison cot seem luxurious. The buzzing intensifies, and you realize with growing dread that something has already gone wrong. Maybe it's the unseasonably cool morning that's made them irritable. Or perhaps a mouse got into one of the hives overnight. Medieval beekeepers knew that disturbed bees could hold grudges for days, tracking down the source of their annoyance with the persistence of medieval tax collectors. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers developed any genuine immunity to bee stings over time, but contemporary accounts suggest that even experienced apiarists regularly suffered from what we'd now recognize as severe allergic reactions. Without access to antihistamines, epinephrine, or even basic first aid, a bad day with the bees often became a permanent one. The morning light reveals the full scope of your predicament. 3 of your 12 hives are in full defensive mode, with guard bees performing their aggressive figure-8 dance patterns around the entrances. This is bee language for we're locked, loaded, and ready to turn the first fool who approaches us into a human pincushion. You need to approach these hives today. Your lord expects his tribute of honey and beeswax, and failure to deliver means losing your small plot of land, which would leave you as one of the faceless masses of medieval serfs wandering the countryside in search of work, food, and a place to die quietly. But first, you need to survive breakfast, and even that simple task becomes infinitely more complicated when you're living in a world where the primary source of sweetener can kill you, where your protective equipment is about as effective as wearing a fishnet shirt to a knife fight, and where the closest thing to medical care is a village-wise woman who thinks bloodletting cures everything from headaches to heartbreak. You take a deep breath of the morning air, thick with pollen and the promise of violence, and wonder if today might be the day you join the countless nameless medieval beekeepers whose careers ended not with retirement, but with a final, fatal encounter with their six-legged overlords. You shuffle toward your cooking area, a pathetic collection of clay pots and iron implements that would make a modern camping enthusiast weep with pity, while the morning chorus of bees grows increasingly agitated outside. Your stomach gnaws at itself with medieval hunger, that particular brand of emptiness that comes from a diet consisting primarily of bread, porridge, and whatever protein you can scavenge from your increasingly hostile business partners. The irony isn't lost on you. You're literally surrounded by one of nature's most perfect foods, yet obtaining it might cost you your life. Medieval breakfast for a beekeeper typically consisted of dark bread made from whatever grains survived the winter, perhaps some thin ale that was safer to drink than the local water supply, and if you were particularly fortunate, a small portion of honey, assuming you could extract it without becoming a casualty of war. The bread sits before you like a dense, brown brick that requires considerable jaw strength to consume. You reach for your precious store of honey, kept in a small clay pot that represents hours of negotiation with creatures that speak only the language of violence. But as you lift the honey pot, disaster strikes with the swift inevitability of medieval justice. 3 scout bees, advanced scouts for their hive's reconnaissance division, have somehow found their way into your dwelling. These aren't lost bees bumbling around in confusion. These are trained assassins conducting surveillance operations, and they've just identified you as public enemy number 1. The first bee dive bombs your hand with kamikaze determination, its stinger connecting with the soft flesh between your thumb and forefinger with surgical precision. The pain explodes through your nervous system like liquid fire, because medieval bee stings weren't just painful. They were designed by evolution to teach mammals not to mess with insects who have spent millions of years perfecting the art of chemical warfare. Your hand swells almost immediately, turning an alarming shade of red that would send modern medical professionals reaching for their emergency kits. But you're not in a modern emergency room. You're in a medieval hovel where the most advanced medical equipment is a rusty knife used for both surgery and cutting bread. The second bee, apparently inspired by its colleague's success, targets your neck with the precision of a medieval executioner. This sting is worse because the skin here is thinner, more sensitive, and closer to major blood vessels that could carry the venom straight to your brain. You slap at the bee with reflexes honed by months of similar encounters, but medieval hand-eye coordination, dulled by poor nutrition and chronic exhaustion, proves inadequate to the task. Here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective. Medieval people understood that bees could be deadly, but they had wildly inaccurate theories about why. Some believed that bee venom was actually beneficial in small doses, an early form of what we'd now call immunotherapy, except administered by creatures with the temperament of tiny, flying berserkers. Others thought that bee stings could cure various ailments, from arthritis to demonic possession, leading to the deeply unfortunate practice of intentional bee sting therapy. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers actually built up immunity over time, or simply learned to hide their suffering more effectively. But contemporary medical texts describe symptoms that sound remarkably like severe allergic reactions: difficulty breathing, widespread swelling, and what medieval physicians delicately termed sudden collapse followed by eternal rest. The third bee, meanwhile, has taken a more strategic approach. Instead of attacking you directly, it's begun releasing alarm pheromones, chemical messages that translate roughly to "Hey everyone, the giant pink threat is in here, and it's time for some group therapy." Within minutes, you can hear the responding buzz of reinforcements approaching your dwelling like medieval cavalry responding to a battle horn. You attempt to continue your breakfast while under siege, trying to chew the brick-like bread with a swelling mouth and maintain some semblance of dignity while being systematically terrorized by insects the size of your thumbnail. The honey, now guarded by its tiny protectors like medieval knights defending a castle, remains tantalizingly out of reach. Your ale provides some relief for your stinging throat, but it also makes you slightly dizzy, not an ideal condition when you need every bit of coordination to avoid further encounters with your airborne tormentors. The morning meal that should have taken minutes stretches into an hour-long ordeal of strategic eating, tactical ducking, and the kind of defensive maneuvering that would impress military historians. By the time you finish choking down your meager breakfast, you've accumulated 4 more stings. Your face resembles a medieval gargoyle, and you're beginning to understand why the average medieval beekeeper's career was measured in seasons rather than decades. With your face swollen to proportions that would make a medieval plague victim seem attractive by comparison, you begin the morning ritual of consulting your collection of beekeeping wisdom, a hodgepodge of folk knowledge, religious superstition, and practical advice that's roughly as reliable as medieval weather forecasting. Your mentor, Old Henrik the Honey-Touched, so named because bees literally touched him to death 3 winters ago, left you a collection of parchments covered in barely legible script that reads like the fever dreams of someone who spent too much time inhaling smoke and bee venom. According to medieval beekeeping lore, bees were simultaneously God's perfect creatures and Satan's tiny demons, capable of both divine inspiration and demonic possession. The church taught that bees were pure because they were supposedly virgin births. Medieval theologians believed bees reproduced without sexual contact, making them nature's little nuns. This led to the deeply problematic belief that bees could sense sin and would attack the morally impure with extra enthusiasm. Given your current condition, you're starting to wonder what exactly you did wrong in the eyes of your six-legged moral guardians. Henrik's notes include helpful advice like speak gently to the bees in Latin, for they understand the language of God, and never approach the hives while angry, lustful, or having recently consumed garlic, for bees despise strong odors and impure thoughts. This creates a fascinating paradox for medieval beekeepers. You need to be spiritually pure to work with bees, but you also need to be tough enough to survive their inevitable attempts to murder you, which requires a certain amount of righteous anger. Most dangerous piece of medieval bee wisdom involves the concept of telling the bees, the belief that major life events must be shared with your colonies, or they'll abandon you, die of grief, or worse, hold you responsible for keeping secrets. Henrik's notes insist that you must inform the bees of deaths, births, marriages, and even significant weather changes, conducting these conversations in a specific ritualistic manner that makes you look like you're having animated discussions with insects. Historians still argue whether this practice actually influenced bee behavior or simply gave medieval beekeepers an excuse to spend time talking to something that couldn't argue back. But here's where medieval bee knowledge gets genuinely terrifying. They were partially right about bee behavior, just for completely wrong reasons. Medieval beekeepers observed that bees became more aggressive during certain weather patterns, around strong scents, and in response to rapid movements. They correctly identified that disturbing one hive could trigger defensive responses in neighboring colonies. However, they attributed these behaviors to supernatural causes, rather than understanding the complex chemical communication systems that actually govern bee behavior. Your morning consultation with Henrik's notes reveals today's particular challenges. The wind is coming from the east, which according to medieval wisdom means the bees will be touched by the devil's breath, and twice as likely to sting. There's a new moon, traditionally considered an unlucky time for honey harvesting, because bees supposedly become moon mad and attack without provocation. Most ominously, Henrik's notes mention that bees can smell fear from great distances and will specifically target frightened beekeepers because terror supposedly makes human blood taste sweeter to them. This last bit of medieval nonsense is actually grounded in a kernel of truth that makes it infinitely more terrifying. Bees can detect the chemical signatures of stress hormones, and frightened humans emit pheromones that trigger defensive responses in bee colonies. So, while medieval beekeepers were wrong about bees wanting to taste your terror-sweetened blood, they were accidentally correct that fear makes you a target. The final piece of Henrik's wisdom involves the concept of bee monarchy, the medieval belief that each hive was ruled by a king bee. They didn't realize the ruler was female, who could command his subjects to attack specific targets. According to the notes, if you offended the king bee, the entire colony would hunt you with coordinated precision until you either fled the area permanently or died trying to appease their royal displeasure. While the gender identification was wrong, medieval beekeepers had accidentally stumbled onto the reality of pheromone-based communication and collective decision-making in bee colonies. As you finish reviewing Henrik's increasingly ominous warnings, you realize that medieval beekeeping knowledge was like a broken clock, occasionally right for completely wrong reasons, but mostly just a collection of superstitions designed to make an already dangerous job seem absolutely suicidal. The morning sun climbs higher, the buzzing outside grows more insistent, and you're beginning to understand why Henrik's final note simply reads, "May God have mercy on your soul, for the bees certainly won't." Time to don your protective equipment. And if you thought medieval armor was inadequate for protecting knights in battle, wait until you see what passed for safety gear in the beekeeping profession. Your protective suit consists of layers that would make modern OSHA inspectors weep with despair. A thick woolen tunic that's supposed to prevent stingers from reaching your skin, but mostly just makes you sweat profusely. Leather gloves that are roughly as flexible as wooden planks, and a hood made from coarse linen that's been treated with beeswax. Ironically, the same substance produced by the creatures trying to kill you. The centerpiece of your defensive ensemble is what medieval beekeepers optimistically called a bee hat, a wide-brimmed affair with a veil made from loosely woven cloth that hangs around your face like medieval mosquito netting. The veil has holes large enough for determined bees to navigate with ease, but it does provide the psychological comfort of feeling slightly less exposed to aerial assault. Medieval beekeepers often stuffed aromatic herbs like mint or lavender into the hat's band, operating under the theory that pleasant smells would make bees less likely to attack. This is roughly equivalent to wearing cologne to discourage wolves. Your feet get wrapped in layers of cloth and leather, creating medieval moon boots that make you about as graceful as a drunk monk attempting ballet. The theory behind foot protection was sound. Bees often attack low targets, and ground-dwelling yellow jackets were frequently mistaken for honeybees by medieval naturalists. But the execution was typically medieval, functional enough to keep you alive, uncomfortable enough to make you question your life choices. The process of getting dressed for beekeeping in medieval times was like preparing for battle, which was entirely appropriate since that's essentially what you were doing. Each layer had to be carefully inspected for gaps, holes, or loose threading that could provide entry points for your tiny adversaries. Medieval cloth wasn't exactly high quality by modern standards, and the kind of rough, homespun fabric available to peasant beekeepers was about as effective at stopping bee stingers as cheesecloth would be at stopping arrows. But here's where medieval ingenuity really shines in its bizarre way. Some beekeepers discovered that smoke made bees less aggressive, leading to the development of portable smokers that were basically handheld fire hazards. Your smoker is a clay pot with holes punched in it, filled with smoldering dried dung, rotten wood, or whatever combustible material you could scavenge. You'll carry this miniature volcano with you, trailing smoke like a mobile campfire while trying not to set yourself ablaze. Medieval fire safety was about as advanced as medieval medicine, which is to say, not at all. Historians still argue whether medieval protective gear actually worked, or if successful beekeepers simply learned to accept a certain level of constant pain as an occupational hazard. But contemporary accounts suggest that experienced beekeepers were easily identifiable by their collection of scars, permanent swelling, and the 1,000-yard stare of people who'd seen too much combat. The psychological aspect of suiting up can't be understated. Every morning, you're essentially putting on the medieval equivalent of a hazmat suit to approach creatures that medieval people genuinely believed could be possessed by demons. The ritual of dressing for beekeeping was part practical preparation, part religious ceremony, and part psychological armor against the very real possibility that today might be the day your tiny business partners decided to hold their own funeral yours. Your final piece of equipment is a wooden hive tool, basically a flat stick, used for prying apart hive components, scraping away wax, and in emergencies, swatting at particularly aggressive bees. This tool represents the pinnacle of medieval beekeeping technology, a stick. Granted, it's a carefully crafted stick made from hardwood and worn smooth by years of use, but it's still fundamentally just a stick. Medieval beekeepers approached swarms of 50,000 aggressive insects, armed with nothing more sophisticated than what a caveman might use to probe a termite mound. As you finish your preparations, checking and double-checking every layer of your medieval hazmat suit, you catch a glimpse of yourself in the polished metal disc that serves as your mirror. You look like a cross between a medieval monk and someone preparing to handle radioactive materials, which is oddly appropriate since bee venom is essentially nature's version of biological warfare. The morning sun is climbing higher. Your protective layers are already making you sweat, and the increasingly agitated buzzing outside suggests that your employers are growing impatient with their slow-moving, inadequately protected human servant. You step outside into the morning air, and immediately the atmosphere changes from merely tense to actively hostile. The bees register your presence like medieval sentries spotting an approaching army, and their collective hum shifts from the casual buzz of morning activity to the focused intensity of creatures preparing for violence. Your first mistake, of many you'll make today, is moving too quickly, approaching the nearest hive with the confident stride of someone who hasn't yet learned that bees interpret rapid movement as aggressive behavior worthy of immediate retaliation. The skep hives arranged around your cottage look deceptively peaceful from a distance, like woven baskets that happen to be vibrating with contained fury. These aren't the neat, box-like structures modern beekeepers use. These are dome-shaped baskets made from coiled straw and held together with clay and hope. Each skep houses a complete civilization that operates according to rules you barely understand, with social hierarchies more complex than medieval nobility and communication systems more sophisticated than anything human society had developed by the 13th century. Your approach to the first hive triggers what can only be described as a medieval air raid alert. Guard bees, the colony's equivalent of castle sentries, emerge from the entrance, performing aggressive flight patterns that serve as their version of drawing swords. These aren't random movements. They're coordinated defensive maneuvers designed to warn intruders and prepare for combat. Medieval beekeepers called this behavior the dance of warning, and experienced apiarists knew to retreat immediately when they saw it. Unfortunately, you're not particularly experienced, and your retreat strategy involves flailing your arms like a medieval scarecrow having a seizure. The first sting comes without warning, delivered by a kamikaze warrior that somehow found the tiny gap between your glove and sleeve. The pain is immediate and intense, but more importantly, this first sting releases alarm pheromones that serve as a chemical battle cry to every other bee in the vicinity. Within seconds, you're not dealing with a single angry insect. You're facing a coordinated military response from creatures that have been perfecting the art of collective violence for millions of years. Here's where medieval beekeeping knowledge proves both surprisingly accurate and completely inadequate. Medieval texts correctly identified that disturbing one hive could trigger aggressive responses from neighboring colonies, a phenomenon they attributed to bees sharing gossip about human misconduct. The reality is that alarm pheromones can travel significant distances, alerting multiple colonies to potential threats. What medieval texts didn't explain was how to deal with this escalating crisis once it began. Beyond advice like pray fervently and run quickly. Your smoker, that primitive fire hazard you've been carrying, becomes both salvation and liability. Smoke does indeed calm bees by masking alarm pheromones and triggering their instinct to prepare for evacuation. Bees associate smoke with forest fires and begin gorging themselves on honey in preparation to flee, making them less likely to sting. However, lighting and maintaining a medieval smoker while under attack by aerial assassins requires the kind of multitasking skills that wouldn't be developed until the invention of video games. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers actually understood why smoke worked or simply observed its effects and developed superstitious explanations. But contemporary accounts suggest that many beekeepers died trying to light their smokers while under attack, creating the grimly ironic situation of being killed by the creatures you were trying to calm. The psychological warfare aspect of bee attacks can't be understated. These insects have evolved to target the most vulnerable parts of human anatomy, eyes, throat, and joints, with surgical precision. They seem to know exactly where to sting to cause maximum pain and debilitation. Your medieval protective gear, already inadequate by modern standards, begins to feel like wearing paper armor against tiny, flying knights armed with poison lances. As more bees join the assault, you realize that medieval beekeepers faced a tactical problem that would challenge modern military strategists. How do you conduct necessary business with entities that view your very existence as an act of war? The bees aren't just defending their territory, they're conducting an active campaign to eliminate you as a threat, using strategies that include flanking maneuvers, coordinated attacks, and what can only be described as psychological warfare. Your retreat to a safe distance, roughly the length of a medieval village from the hives, gives you time to reassess the situation while nursing your growing collection of stings. The morning that started with simple plans to check your hives has devolved into a military engagement where you're severely outgunned, outnumbered, and operating with inferior technology. The bees, meanwhile, have regrouped and are maintaining aggressive patrol patterns around their territory, making it clear that any attempt to approach will be met with escalated force. After regrouping and tending to your wounds with what passes for medieval first aid, basically, cursing creatively while applying mud mixed with whatever herbs you hope might reduce swelling, you realize that retreat isn't an option. Your feudal lord expects his tribute of honey, and failure to deliver means losing your small plot of land, which would leave you joining the ranks of masterless peasants wandering the countryside in search of work and a place to die quietly. So despite every instinct screaming at you to flee, you must return to the battlefield armed with nothing more than your smoker, your questionable protective gear, and the kind of desperate courage that only comes from having no alternatives. Medieval honey harvesting was less like modern beekeeping and more like conducting a raid on a fortified enemy position. The process required you to essentially destroy part of the hive to access the honey, since skep hives couldn't be opened and inspected like modern boxes. You'd have to cut sections of comb directly from the hive, a process that guaranteed massive structural damage to the bees' carefully constructed home. Imagine someone breaking into your house, stealing your furniture, and then expecting you to remain calm about the situation. Your first step involves smoking the hive heavily enough to send the bees into their evacuation response, but not so heavily that you suffocate them or set the entire structure ablaze. Medieval fire control was about as precise as medieval surgery, which is to say, frequently fatal for all parties involved. You approach the target hive with your smoker trailing clouds of acrid smoke that smell like burning barnyard, because that's essentially what it is: dried animal dung being slowly combusted in a clay pot. The bees' response to smoke is immediate, but not necessarily cooperative. While some begin gorging themselves on honey in preparation for evacuation, others interpret the smoke as a direct attack and respond with increased aggression. Medieval beekeepers operated under the theory that good smoke would calm bees, while bad smoke would enrage them. but they had no reliable way to distinguish between the two until it was too late. Your smoke, produced from whatever combustible materials you could scavenge, falls firmly into the questionably effective category. With the hive somewhat subdued, you begin the delicate process of cutting into the skep with a sharp knife, the same knife you use for everything from food preparation to emergency surgery. Medieval beekeepers didn't have specialized equipment. They had tools that served multiple purposes, often simultaneously. The knife needs to be sharp enough to cut through wax and comb cleanly. But medieval metallurgy wasn't exactly known for producing razor-sharp implements that held their edge. As you slice into the hive, you're essentially performing surgery on a living superorganism, while its immune system tries to kill you. The first cut releases a flood of bees that had been trapped inside, each one emerging with the fury of someone whose house has just been burglarized. These aren't the relatively calm bees from outside the hive. These are the interior guards who have been marinating in alarm pheromones and are absolutely convinced that you're the apocalypse incarnate. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers actually planned their harvesting strategies or simply attacked hives with the desperate enthusiasm of people who knew they probably wouldn't survive the process. But contemporary accounts suggest that honey harvesting was often a communal activity where multiple people would take turns being primary targets, while others grabbed whatever honey they could reach. The honey you're extracting isn't the clear, filtered product of modern apiaries. Medieval honey comes complete with chunks of wax, bits of dead bees, larvae in various stages of development, and whatever debris the bees had incorporated into their comb construction. The sight of partially developed bee grubs embedded in your breakfast sweetener would be disturbing enough under normal circumstances. But when you're being actively attacked by their adult relatives, it takes on the quality of particularly vindictive warfare. Your medieval extraction process involves cutting away sections of comb, dropping them into a cloth bag, and hoping to squeeze out enough honey to satisfy your lord's tribute demands, while leaving enough in the hive for the bees to survive the winter. This calculation was pure guesswork, since medieval beekeepers had no way to accurately assess how much honey a colony needed for winter survival. Too much extraction meant dead bees, too little meant angry lords, and both outcomes typically resulted in dead beekeepers. As you work, more bees arrive from neighboring hives, drawn by the alarm pheromones and the unmistakable scent of their cousins' destroyed home. What started as a single hive operation escalates into a multi-colony conflict, with you at the center of an increasingly violent territorial dispute. The morning that began with simple honey harvesting has evolved into something resembling medieval siege warfare, except you're simultaneously the attacker and the one under siege. With your honey harvesting operation having devolved into something resembling the siege of a medieval castle, if castles could fly and inject poison directly into your bloodstream. You now face the secondary challenge of processing beeswax while being actively hunted by increasingly organized squadrons of aerial terrorists. Medieval beeswax wasn't just a byproduct of honey extraction. It was often more valuable than the honey itself, used for everything from church candles to sealing important documents, which meant you couldn't simply abandon this phase of the operation despite the obvious threat to your continued existence. The beeswax processing area behind your cottage has become a war zone where you must simultaneously tend a fire, melt waxy combs, and maintain defensive vigilance against creatures that have apparently developed military tactics specifically designed to target wax processors. The irony isn't lost on you that you're using the bees' own architectural achievements as fuel for a process they seem to interpret as the ultimate insult to their engineering prowess. Your medieval wax rendering setup consists of a large iron pot suspended over an open fire, into which you'll melt the comb sections while trying not to incinerate yourself, the wax, or the surrounding countryside. Medieval fire safety protocols were essentially don't burn down the village, which set a fairly low bar for success. The process requires constant attention because beeswax has an annoying tendency to burst into flames when overheated, creating a situation where your primary product can instantly transform into your primary threat. But here's where the situation transcends normal occupational hazards into the realm of supernatural warfare. The scent of melting beeswax acts like a chemical beacon that attracts every bee within a considerable radius. It's as if you've lit a signal fire announcing, human-destroying bee architecture here. Come quickly if you want to participate in justified revenge. Medieval beekeepers called this phenomenon the calling of the wax, and experienced apiarists knew to conduct wax rendering far from their hives, preferably in locations that offered multiple escape routes. The first wave of wax-attracted bees arrives like medieval cavalry responding to a battle horn, and they're noticeably more aggressive than the bees you dealt with during honey harvesting. These aren't just defending their own hives, they're responding to what they perceive as an attack on bee civilization itself. The chemical signature of melting wax apparently triggers some kind of species-wide defense protocol that turns normally manageable bees into tiny, flying berserkers. As you stir the melting comb with a long wooden paddle, medieval cooking implement, bee defense tool, and emergency weapon all in one, the situation deteriorates with the swift inevitability of most medieval enterprises. The fire needs constant tending to maintain the right temperature, but every time you lean over the pot, you present an ideal target for bees conducting diving attacks on your exposed neck and face. Your protective veil, already compromised by morning combat, proves about as effective as medieval diplomacy at preventing direct strikes to sensitive areas. Historians still argue whether medieval wax processing was actually profitable enough to justify the obvious risks, or if beekeepers simply had no choice but to complete the entire honey-to-wax production cycle because their feudal obligations demanded finished products rather than raw materials. But contemporary accounts suggest that wax rendering days had casualty rates comparable to minor military engagements. The psychological warfare escalates as more bees arrive and begin what can only be described as coordinated harassment campaigns. Groups of bees take turns conducting attack runs on your position, while others maintain hovering surveillance, creating a rotation system that ensures you're never free from aerial threat. They've essentially established air superiority over your wax processing operation, and you're conducting industrial activity while under constant bombardment by creatures that seem to have studied medieval siege tactics. Your attempts to maintain the fire, stir the wax, and defend yourself simultaneously require the kind of multitasking skills that would challenge modern professionals. But you're operating with medieval tools, medieval protective equipment, and a medieval understanding of the chemical processes involved. The wax rendering process, which should take a few hours under normal circumstances, stretches into an all-day ordeal of strategic retreats, tactical advances, and the kind of defensive maneuvering that would impress military historians. The final insult comes when you realize that the quality of your wax depends on careful temperature control and timing, factors that become nearly impossible to manage when you're being systematically terrorized by insects that apparently understand the economic importance of sabotaging your production process. Medieval wax had to meet specific standards for church use, and poor quality wax could result in accusations of everything from incompetence to heresy, both of which carried penalties that made bee stings seem like minor inconveniences. By midday, your body has become a living catalog of medieval bee sting treatment methods, most of which would be considered torture by modern medical standards, but represent the cutting edge of 13th century emergency care. Your face has swollen to proportions that would make a medieval gargoyle seem handsome by comparison, and your hands resemble inflated pig bladders more than functional human appendages. It's time to consult the village wise woman, Agatha the Herb-Touched, whose medical credentials consist entirely of having survived longer than most people who attempt to treat bee stings with medieval remedies. Agatha's treatment philosophy operates on the medieval medical principle that like cures like, which means treating bee stings with bee-related substances. Her first recommendation involves applying crushed bee bodies directly to fresh sting sites, operating under the theory that the bee's own essence will convince the venom to retreat. This is roughly equivalent to treating a knife wound by rubbing it with pieces of the blade. But medieval logic wasn't particularly concerned with what modern people might call scientific validity. The second phase of treatment involves a poultice made from ingredients that sound like they were selected by someone having vivid hallucinations. Powdered unicorn horn, actually ground rhinoceros horn, traded from merchants who may or may not have been honest about their product's origins. Dried toad skin, and herbs blessed by a priest who may or may not have been sober when he performed the blessing ceremony. Medieval medical supplies were about as reliable as medieval military intelligence, which is to say, frequently fictional. Agatha's internal remedies prove even more alarming than her topical treatments. She prescribes a tonic made from fermented honey mixed with ground pearls, operating under the medieval belief that expensive ingredients are inherently more medicinal than affordable ones. The logic seems to be that if something costs enough to bankrupt a peasant family, it must possess magical healing properties. This economic approach to medicine resulted in treatments that were often more financially devastating than the original injury. But here's where medieval medicine accidentally stumbles onto something resembling effectiveness. Agatha recommends consuming large quantities of ale to dilute the bee poison in your blood. While her understanding of human physiology is roughly as accurate as medieval astronomy, alcohol does provide some pain relief and can help with the psychological trauma of being systematically terrorized by insects. The most dangerous aspect of Agatha's treatment involves bloodletting, the medieval cure-all that was applied to everything from headaches to demonic possession. Her theory is that bee venom has heated your blood to an unnatural temperature, and that releasing some of this corrupted fluid will restore your body's natural balance. She produces a collection of metal instruments that look like they were designed by someone who learned surgery from watching public executions. And the thought of having your blood drained while already weakened from multiple bee stings seems like accelerating your journey toward medieval martyrdom. Fortunately, before Agatha can begin her bloodletting procedure, a new crisis emerges that makes your medical treatment seem like a minor concern. The afternoon weather is changing, and medieval beekeepers knew that certain atmospheric conditions could transform manageable bee colonies into roving bands of aerial terrorists. The barometric pressure is dropping, humidity is rising, and storm clouds are gathering on the horizon, conditions that make bees irritable enough to launch coordinated attacks on anything that moves within a considerable radius of their territory. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually understood the relationship between weather patterns and bee behavior, or if they simply observed correlations and developed superstitious explanations. But contemporary accounts consistently mention that beekeepers avoided working during certain weather conditions, particularly the hours before thunderstorms, when bees seemed possessed by what medieval people called storm madness. Your partially treated stings continue to throb with medieval intensity while you contemplate the approaching weather crisis. Agatha's remedies have provided minimal relief, but maximum additional discomfort, and you're beginning to understand why medieval medical treatment often killed patients faster than their original ailments. The combination of bee venom, questionable herbal remedies, and the psychological stress of knowing that worse weather is coming creates a perfect storm of medieval misery. The afternoon sun disappears behind increasingly threatening clouds, and the air takes on that electric quality that precedes violent weather. Every bee within miles seems to sense the approaching storm, and their behavior shifts from merely aggressive to absolutely homicidal. Medieval beekeepers called this phenomenon the devil's weather, and experienced apiarists knew to seek shelter immediately when they observed these signs. Unfortunately, seeking shelter means abandoning your hives to whatever damage the storm might bring, and unprotected hives rarely survived severe weather without human intervention. As you weigh your options, continued medical treatment that might kill you, or attempting to protect your hives during weather that will definitely kill you, the first fat raindrops begin to fall, and the collective buzz of agitated bees rises to a pitch that sounds like nature's own air raid siren announcing the beginning of the apocalypse. The storm arrives with the subtle grace of a medieval cavalry charge, transforming the afternoon from merely dangerous to actively apocalyptic. The first drops of rain hit your swollen face like liquid hammers, and each droplet seems to carry the concentrated fury of the weather gods, who have apparently decided that your day hasn't been sufficiently challenging. But rain is the least of your problems. The real crisis is that thousands of bees, already agitated by your morning honey theft and afternoon wax destruction, are now entering what medieval beekeepers called storm fury, a condition that transforms even docile colonies into flying death squads. Medieval weather forecasting consisted mainly of observing animal behavior and hoping for the best, but beekeepers developed surprisingly accurate methods for predicting bee-hostile weather conditions. The signs were all there. The way guard bees had been flying erratic patterns since dawn, the unusual silence from normally active hives, and the fact that even the sparrows had stopped singing, a phenomenon medieval people believed indicated that God's creatures sensed the devil's approach. Modern meteorology would explain this as animals responding to barometric pressure changes, but the practical result was the same. Everything with wings was preparing for war. Your hives, those dome-shaped baskets that represent your entire livelihood, are about as weather-resistant as medieval umbrellas, which is to say, essentially decorative. Skep hives were designed for convenience and portability, not storm survival, and a serious downpour could destroy months of bee work in minutes. The bees know this, which explains why they've shifted from defensive behavior to what can only be described as preemptive strikes against anything they perceive as a threat to their storm preparations. The wind picks up with medieval subtlety, meaning it goes from calm to gale force without bothering with intermediate stages. And suddenly, you're not just dealing with angry bees. You're dealing with angry bees being hurled around by air currents that turn their already unpredictable flight patterns into completely chaotic assault vectors. Medieval people believed that storms were caused by demons fighting in the sky, and watching thousands of bees being tossed around by invisible forces while trying to attack you certainly supports that theological interpretation. Your protective gear, barely adequate under normal conditions becomes completely useless in storm conditions. The wind catches your linen veil and transforms it into a medieval sail that obscures your vision while providing highway access for any bees enterprising enough to navigate the flapping fabric. Your wool tunic, already soaked with sweat from the day's activities, becomes a water-absorbing sponge that makes you both heavier and more uncomfortable while providing exactly zero additional protection against aerial assault. Here's where medieval bee knowledge proves both surprisingly sophisticated and utterly inadequate. Experienced beekeepers knew that bees became exponentially more dangerous during storms, but their understanding of why was typically medieval, a mixture of accurate observation and supernatural explanation. They correctly identified that bees attack more frequently during weather changes, but attributed this to demons possessing the insects, rather than understanding the biochemical effects of barometric pressure on insect behavior. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers had effective strategies for managing storm-agitated bees, or if they simply accepted that storm days were likely to be their last days. But contemporary accounts suggest that many beekeepers died during weather emergencies while trying to protect hives that could have been replaced more easily than human lives. The psychological warfare aspect reaches new heights during storm conditions. Bees that have been harassing you individually throughout the day begin coordinating group attacks, with multiple insects striking simultaneously from different directions. It's as if the approaching storm has activated some kind of hive mind battle protocol that transforms scattered skirmishes into organized military campaigns. You're no longer dealing with annoyed insects. You're facing a coordinated enemy force conducting tactical operations against a specific target. Your attempts to secure the hives while under attack require the kind of multitasking that would challenge modern special forces operatives, but you're equipped with medieval technology and operating under medieval understanding of crisis management. Each hive needs to be weighted down with stones to prevent wind damage, but approaching any hive triggers immediate attack responses from bees that interpret your storm preparation efforts as continued acts of war against their civilization. The rain intensifies from occasional drops to steady precipitation, and you realize with growing horror that wet bees are significantly more aggressive than dry bees. Medieval beekeepers believed this was because water awakened the devil's essence in bee venom, but modern understanding suggests that wet bees simply can't fly effectively and respond to this vulnerability with increased defensive behavior. Either way, the practical result is that your already impossible situation has just become exponentially worse. As thunder begins rumbling in the distance, and the first lightning flashes illuminate the battlefield around your cottage, you're forced to make the kind of desperate tactical decision that defines medieval survival. Continue trying to protect your livelihood while being systematically destroyed by the creatures you're trying to help, or retreat to shelter and hope that both you and your bees survive the storm independently. Medieval life was full of these charming no-win scenarios where every available option led to different forms of potential disaster. As the storm reaches its crescendo and afternoon fades toward evening, you discover that medieval bees operate on the same principle as medieval armies. They become most dangerous when cornered and desperate. The approaching darkness should theoretically calm the bees as they settle into their evening routines. But storm-agitated colonies follow entirely different behavioral patterns. Instead of returning peacefully to their hives, they're conducting what can only be described as organized siege warfare against anything that moves within their expanding territory of aggression. Your evening feeding ritual, normally a relatively peaceful process of providing sugar water to colonies that need supplemental nutrition, has transformed into something resembling diplomatic negotiations with hostile foreign powers, except the diplomats are armed with biological weapons and have no interest in peaceful resolution. Medieval beekeepers understood that colonies needed feeding during certain seasons, but they approached this necessity with the same fatalistic acceptance they applied to other potentially lethal occupational requirements. The sugar water you've prepared using precious honey reserves mixed with rainwater represents a significant investment in materials you can barely afford to spare. Medieval sweeteners were luxury items, and using honey to feed bees was like using gold coins to pay copper debts, economically questionable, but occasionally necessary for survival. The feeding process requires approaching each hive with containers of liquid nutrition, while creatures that have spent the entire day trying to murder you decide whether to accept your peace offering or interpret it as another act of war. Your first approach to the feeding station triggers an immediate military response from the nearest colony. Guard bees emerge performing flight patterns that medieval beekeepers called the dance of final warning. Aggressive figure-8 formations that served as the bee equivalent of drawing swords and announcing formal combat intentions. These aren't the relatively manageable defensive behaviors you dealt with during morning honey harvesting. These are coordinated tactical maneuvers designed to eliminate threats rather than simply discourage them. The feeding containers, simple clay bowls that you'll place near hive entrances, become focal points for conflicts that transcend normal territorial disputes. Multiple colonies seem to interpret your feeding efforts as attempts to establish control over their food sources, leading to interhive conflicts that turn your cottage area into a multi-faction war zone. Medieval beekeepers occasionally dealt with bee wars, where neighboring colonies would fight each other, but storm conditions seemed to trigger alliance formations, where normally competitive hives would cooperate against common threats, specifically you. As darkness approaches, you realize that medieval beekeeping wisdom contains very little guidance for managing evening activities during crisis conditions. Most traditional advice assumes normal weather and reasonably cooperative bees, conditions that haven't existed in your vicinity since dawn. The few relevant passages in Henrik's notes mostly consist of prayers and recommendations for making peace with God before attempting evening hive management during storms. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers actually had effective techniques for managing storm day evening activities, or if they simply hoped to survive long enough to deal with the aftermath. But contemporary accounts suggest that many beekeeping careers ended during evening feeding attempts, when exhausted, injured beekeepers made fatal mistakes while dealing with maximally agitated colonies. The lightning provides intermittent illumination that reveals the full scope of your situation. Thousands of bees maintaining aggressive patrol patterns around your cottage, multiple hives showing signs of storm damage that will require immediate repair work, and weather conditions that show no signs of improving before nightfall. Medieval people believed that lightning could drive bees permanently insane, and watching the erratic flight patterns illuminated by each flash certainly supports that interpretation. Your feeding mission becomes a series of tactical advances and strategic retreats, with each attempt to place nutrition containers triggering coordinated responses from multiple colonies. The bees have apparently established communication networks that allow them to coordinate attacks across significant distances, turning individual feeding stations into contested territory that requires military-style planning to approach safely. The psychological pressure of conducting necessary work while under constant attack reaches levels that would challenge modern military personnel. But you're operating with medieval understanding of stress management, which consisted mainly of prayer, alcohol consumption, and fatalistic acceptance of probable death. The combination of physical exhaustion, accumulated bee stings, questionable medical treatment, and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring similar challenges creates the kind of existential despair that characterized much of medieval working life. As the last light fades from the storm-darkened sky, you realize that the day's survival challenges are transitioning into night's survival challenges. And medieval nights were significantly more dangerous than medieval days, especially when you've spent the day systematically antagonizing every bee within a considerable radius of your sleeping location. The approaching darkness brings what medieval people optimistically called the peace of evening. But you're beginning to suspect that whoever coined that phrase never spent a day being systematically terrorized by insects that apparently don't observe normal circadian rhythms when they've been sufficiently provoked. Medieval wisdom insisted that bees returned to their hives at sunset and remained peacefully inactive until dawn. But medieval wisdom also insisted that the earth was flat and that diseases were caused by bad air, so its reliability regarding angry bee behavior is somewhat questionable. Your cottage, which should represent safety and shelter from the day's aerial warfare, feels more like a medieval fortress under siege. The gaps in your thatched roof that seemed like minor inconveniences this morning now represent potential entry points for reconnaissance missions by creatures that have demonstrated both tactical sophistication and personal vendettas against your continued existence. Medieval construction wasn't exactly known for being bee-proof, and the spaces between roof thatch, wall stones, and door frames create a network of access routes that would challenge modern security experts. The sound of your own breathing seems unnaturally loud in the evening quiet, punctuated by the occasional buzz of what you desperately hope are individual bees conducting routine patrols rather than advanced scouts for nighttime operations. Medieval people believed that certain types of bees were nocturnal demons that could navigate in complete darkness using supernatural senses. And while this was obviously superstitious nonsense, the psychological effect of believing your enemies might possess supernatural abilities adds an extra layer of terror to an already challenging situation. Your evening meal preparation becomes an exercise in paranoid vigilance, with every shadow potentially concealing aerial threats, and every sound requiring investigation to determine if it represents normal cottage settling or incoming attack formations. Medieval cooking wasn't exactly a quiet activity. Iron pots, wooden implements, and open fires create considerable noise. But tonight, every clatter seems to announce your exact location to anything that might be listening with malicious intent. The process of tending your evening fire takes on military significance as you realize that light attracts insects, but darkness leaves you vulnerable to attacks you can't see coming. Medieval people solved this problem by going to sleep immediately after sunset. But that option isn't available when you're operating on medieval-grade adrenaline mixed with the kind of hypervigilance that comes from spending 12 hours being hunted by creatures that remember your scent and hold grudges. Here's where medieval bee knowledge proves both comforting and terrifying. Experienced beekeepers knew that certain weather conditions could trigger nighttime bee activity, but they had no effective strategies for dealing with nocturnal attacks beyond hiding and hoping. Medieval defensive architecture wasn't designed to repel flying enemies smaller than sparrows, and your cottage's defensive capabilities against aerial assault are roughly equivalent to those of a medieval tent. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers actually experienced nighttime bee attacks, or if these accounts represent psychological trauma manifesting as paranoid delusions. But contemporary medical texts describe symptoms that sound remarkably like what modern psychologists would recognize as combat stress reactions combined with systematic sleep deprivation. Your attempts to achieve something resembling rest are complicated by the need to maintain awareness of potential threats, while your body processes the day's accumulation of bee venom, questionable medical treatments, and stress hormones. Medieval people didn't understand the biochemical effects of sustained stress, but they recognized that beekeepers often developed what they called bee madness, a condition characterized by paranoid vigilance, inability to sleep, and the conviction that insects were conducting organized campaigns against specific individuals. The cottage noises that normally provide comfort, the settling of wood, the whisper of wind through thatch, the distant sounds of other medieval people conducting their own evening routines, now require constant analysis to distinguish between normal sounds and potential evidence of incoming aerial reconnaissance. Medieval architecture was designed to keep out large threats like wolves and bandits, not tiny threats that could exploit any gap larger than a coin. As you finally attempt to settle into your medieval bed, that collection of straw and regret that passes for sleeping accommodations, you realize that the day's survival challenges haven't ended. They've simply transitioned into nighttime survival challenges that require different skills but equal vigilance. Medieval nights were dangerous under the best circumstances, and you've managed to make your particular night significantly more dangerous by spending the day antagonizing creatures that are perfectly capable of conducting nocturnal operations. The last thought before you drift into the kind of exhausted semi-consciousness that medieval people called sleep is the realization that dawn will bring another day of identical challenges, and your survival statistics aren't improving with experience. Medieval beekeeping was less like learning a trade and more like participating in a daily lottery where the stakes were your continued existence, and the odds were definitely not in your favor. The pre-dawn hours stretch endlessly as you drift between fitful sleep and hypervigilant wakefulness, every sound requiring analysis to determine if it represents normal medieval background noise or evidence that your six-legged adversaries have organized nighttime operations. Medieval sleep wasn't exactly restful under normal circumstances. Straw mattresses were roughly as comfortable as sleeping on a pile of medieval tax documents. But tonight your rest is punctuated by dreams of coordinated aerial assaults and the persistent conviction that tiny reconnaissance teams are conducting intelligence gathering operations around your cottage. The first pale light of dawn creeps through the gaps in your shutters like reluctant medieval sunlight, revealing a world that looks deceptively peaceful after yesterday's systematic warfare. The morning air carries the familiar buzz of bee activity, but today the sound seems different, more organized, more purposeful, as if overnight your various enemy colonies have established communication networks and developed coordinated strategies for dealing with the human threat that has been systematically disrupting their civilization. Your body has become a living museum of medieval beekeeping occupational hazards. Swollen joints that make movement painful, sting sites that throb with the rhythm of your medieval heartbeat, and an overall sense of having survived something that was designed to be unsurvivable. Medieval people didn't understand the cumulative effects of bee venom on human physiology, but they recognized that beekeepers often developed what they called the bee sickness, a condition characterized by chronic pain, unpredictable swelling, and the kind of fatalistic outlook that comes from daily proximity to creatures that view your existence as a personal insult. As you contemplate the approaching day, you realize that medieval beekeeping wasn't just an occupation. It was a form of slow-motion combat, where victory was measured not by conquering your opponents, but by surviving long enough to repeat the same deadly routine tomorrow. The bees haven't been defeated by yesterday's activities. They've been educated. They now know your scent, your defensive capabilities, your preferred approach routes, and your tactical limitations. Today's operations will be conducted against enemies that have learned from yesterday's encounters and adapted their strategies accordingly. The morning ritual of preparing for another day of potential martyrdom takes on a different quality when you understand that you're not learning a trade, you're participating in an ongoing war where the learning curve is measured in casualties, and the retirement plan consists entirely of hoping to die of something other than bee stings. Medieval career counseling didn't include extensive discussions of long-term survival statistics, but if it had, beekeeping would have been classified alongside activities like professional plague victim and volunteer dragon food. Your protective equipment, hastily repaired during the night with materials that were questionable when new, now represents the kind of defensive preparation that medieval people applied to obviously suicidal endeavors. Every gap patched with inadequate materials, every repair held together by hope and desperation, every layer applied with the knowledge that it might delay, but probably won't prevent your eventual defeat by creatures that have been perfecting the art of collective violence for millions of years. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers actually survived long enough to develop genuine expertise, or if the profession existed in a state of constant turnover, where experienced practitioners were regularly replaced by optimistic novices who hadn't yet learned that bee-related death was more common than bee-related prosperity. But the archaeological evidence suggests that medieval beekeeping equipment was designed for frequent replacement rather than long-term use. The approaching sunrise brings with it the realization that you've survived one complete cycle of medieval beekeeping, which puts you in the minority of people who attempt this profession and live to discuss the experience. Medieval occupational safety consisted mainly of prayer and luck, both of which have served you adequately so far. But the statistical reality is that each day's survival makes the next day's survival slightly less probable, not more. As you prepare to face another day of systematic terrorism by creatures that remember your previous offenses and have apparently spent the night planning improved responses, you begin to understand why medieval people viewed beekeeping as a form of religious devotion, not because it was spiritually uplifting, but because it required the kind of faith that comes from repeatedly engaging in activities that any reasonable person would recognize as obviously lethal. The morning buzz grows stronger, more organized, and you realize that your opponents have regrouped, resupplied, and are preparing to resume operations against a target they now know intimately. Yesterday was reconnaissance. Today is the real war. Here, in these final moments before dawn fully breaks, let your breathing slow and your muscles relax. The morning light grows softer now, filtering through medieval mist that makes everything seem distant and dreamlike. Your cottage, that humble fortress that protected you through the night, settles into peaceful quiet around you. The distant buzz of your aerial adversaries fades into background white noise, no more threatening than the whisper of wind through wheat fields or the gentle murmur of a distant stream. Rest your medieval bones against the straw mattress that suddenly feels more comfortable than any modern bed. Let your swollen hands, those instruments of survival, rest peacefully at your sides. The morning stretches endlessly ahead, full of possibilities that seem less frightening and more like distant adventures you might choose to experience or simply observe from this peaceful vantage point of half sleep. The sun rises slowly over your medieval world, painting everything in soft gold that makes even the beehives look like decorative garden features rather than fortified enemy positions. Your breathing deepens, matching the quiet rhythm of morning itself, and somewhere in the distance, the church bells begin their ancient song of time passing peacefully, marking hours that stretch like honey, sweet and golden, and infinitely slow. Close your eyes now, medieval beekeeper. Your tiny winged adversaries are settling into their own morning routines, and for this moment, this perfect quiet moment, there is peace in the ancient dance between human ambition and nature's gentle indifference. The morning mist rises from warming earth, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise that some battles are worth fighting, even when victory looks suspiciously like simply surviving until tomorrow. Sleep now, brave keeper of the hives. The bees will wait, as they always have, as they always will, patient as time itself, while you dream of honey and sunshine and mornings that begin with possibilities instead of warfare.